to try and get to the appendix. Let's see. Effects on the churches. Obviously, church members are caught in the net of propaganda and react pretty much like anyone else. As a result, an almost complete disassociation takes place between their Christianity and their behavior. Their Christianity remains a spiritual and purely internal thing, but their behavior is dictated by various appurtenances and particularly by propaganda. What's an appurtenance? The fuck? A prudence? A prudence. Appurtenance. Appurtenance.
Appurtenance.
Appurtenance. The fuck? An accessory or other item associated with a particular activity or style of living.
Appurtenance.
Appurtenance. Weird. A weird word. Odd. Okay. Their behavior is dictated by various appurtenances and particularly by propaganda. Of course, a certain gap has always existed between ideals and action. But today, this gap has become total, general, and deliberate. This widening of the gap, particularly in its systemic widening, is the fruit of propaganda in the political or economic domain and of advertising in the private domain. Because Christians are flooded with various propagandas, they absolutely cannot see what they might do that would be effective and at the same time be an expression of their Christianity. Therefore, with different motivations and often with scruples, they limit themselves to one or another course presented to them by propaganda. They, too, take the panorama of the various propagandas for living political reality and do not see where they can insert their Christianity in that fictitious panorama. Thus, like all others, they are stumped, and this fact removes all weight from their belief. At the same time, because of its psychological effects, propaganda makes the propagation of Christianity increasingly difficult. The psychological structures built by propaganda are not propitious to Christian beliefs. This also applies on the social plane, for propaganda faces the church with the following dilemma. Either not to make propaganda, but then while the churches slowly and carefully win a man to Christianity, the mass media quickly mobilizes the masses, and churchmen gain the impression of being out of step on the fringes of history and without power to change a thing. Or to make propaganda. This dilemma is surely one of the most cruel with which the churches are faced at present. For it seems that people manipulated by propaganda become increasingly impervious to spiritual realities, less and less suited for the autonomy of a Christian life. We are seeing a considerable religious transformation by which the religious element, through the means of myth, is being absorbed little by propaganda and becoming one of its categories. But we must ask ourselves, what happens if the church gives in and resorts to propaganda? I already have stressed the total character of propaganda. Christians often claim they can separate material devices from propaganda. Techniques break the system. For example, they think they can use press and radio without using the psychological principles or techniques that these media demand, or that they can use these media without having to appeal to conditioned reflexes, myths, and so on, or that they can use them from time to time with care and discretion. What's up, St. Tommy? Is this a Bruce safe zone with no link? A link to what? I'm reading a book. I can't host an open panel because I don't want to sit here and like bullshit about nothing like Smokey or all these people that host open panels and have nothing to fucking talk about and rely on people joining their panel to bring topics or present information. So like I don't have people don't like me. They're not going to join my panel. No one wants to fucking talk to me. No one wants to listen to what I have to say. I just read book, man. I'm a loser. I'm a loser, St. Tommy. So why don't you kill me? Okay. The only answer. Okay, we're talking about churches using propaganda and some of the excuses that a Christian church might give for using propaganda. The only answer one can give to these timid souls is that such restraint would lead to total lack of effectiveness. If a church wants to use propaganda in order to be effective, just as all the others, it must use the entire system with all its resources. It cannot pick what it likes, for such distinctions would destroy the very effectiveness for which the church would make propaganda in the first place. Propaganda is a total system that one must accept or reject in its entirety. Interesting. Many peeps love me. Yeah, right. Maybe some people do. If the church accepts it, two important consequences follow. If the church accepts propaganda. First of all, Christianity disseminated by such means is not Christianity. We have already seen the effect of propaganda on ideology. In fact, what happens as soon as the church avails itself of propaganda is a reduction of Christianity to the level of all other ideologies or secular religions. This can be seen happening throughout history. Every time a church tried to act through the propaganda devices accepted by an epoch, the truth and authenticity of Christianity were debased. This happens in the 4th, 9th, and 17th centuries. Of course, this does not mean that no more Christians were left as a result. So he's saying that throughout history, when the church uses propaganda, it debases the truth and authenticity of Christianity, but that doesn't mean that Christianity was destroyed entirely. There were still Christians left. Okay. In such moments, when acting through propaganda, Christianity ceases to be an overwhelming power and spiritual adventure and becomes institutionalized in all its expressions and compromised in all its actions. It serves everybody as an ideology with the greatest of ease, and tends to be a hoax. In such times, there appear innumerable sweetenings and adaptations which denature Christianity by adjusting it to the milieu. Thus, reduced to nothing more than an ideology, Christianity will be treated as such by the propagandist. And in the modern world, we can repeat in connection with this particular ideology what we have already said on the subject of ideologies in general. What happens is that the church will be able to move the masses and convert thousands of people to its ideology. But this ideology will no longer be Christianity. It will be just another doctrine, though it will still contain, sometimes but not always, some of the original principles and the Christian vocabulary. The other consequence affects the church itself. When it uses propaganda, the church succeeds just as all other organizations. It reaches the masses, influences collective opinions, leads sociological movements, and even makes many people accept what seem to be Christianity. But in doing that, the church becomes a false church. It acquires power and influence that are of this world, and through them integrates itself into this world. From the moment the church exposes itself to the conflict between sociological determinants and a contrary inspiration that comes from God and is directed toward God, from the moment the church uses propaganda and uses it successfully, it becomes, unremittingly, a purely sociological organization. It loses the spiritual part, for it now transmits only a false Christianity. It subordinates the essence of its being to sociological determination. It submits to the laws of efficiency in order to become a power in the world. And, in fact, it succeeds. It does become such a power. At that moment, it has chosen power above truth. When the church uses propaganda, it always tries to justify itself in two ways. It says, first of all, that it puts these efficient media in the service of Jesus Christ. But if one reflects for a moment, one realizes that this means nothing. What is in the service of Jesus Christ receives its character and effectiveness from Jesus Christ. The media that possesses in themselves all their effectiveness and contain in themselves their own presuppositions and ends cannot be put in the services of Jesus Christ. They obey their own rules, and this cannot be changed in the slightest, either by the content of their transmissions or by theological reasoning, despite what simplistic reasoning can make some people believe. In fact, a statement by the church that is placing the media at the service of Christ is not a logical or ethical explanation, but a pious formula without content. I like this chapter. We're finally talking about church and Jesus. One tries to escape from this trap by saying that one cannot see why the church should be prevented from using such an instrument of dissemination or power, so long as it does not put its confidence in such instruments. For one recalls from the Bible that confidence in anything other than God is condemned. Wait a minute, but Joel says science proves God. Are you saying that Joel is full of shit? My God. Yep, that's the thing. Our confidence, the truth, should come from God. The confidence and truth does not come from science, does not come from a political leader, a sports athlete, a fucking rock star. Fucking academia. But here it is. Enough. Okay, what am I talking about? Okay, so we're talking about the church shouldn't be prevented from using propaganda so long as it does not put confidence in propaganda. Okay, but here it is enough to ask oneself, if one really does not believe in these instruments and really does not put one's confidence in them, why use them? If one uses them, one has confidence in their value and effectiveness. To deny this is hypocrisy. Of course, in connection with all this, we are thinking of real propaganda, not of some limited use of press or radio to transmit a mass or service. Okay, so we're talking about real propaganda. That's like the total use of everything. Media, press, entertainment, everything. And if you're just if you're just like a lone radio broadcast, like this, like my YouTube channel is not propaganda because it's isolated. Propaganda has to cover the whole spectrum of, like, you know, influence. At the end of this brief analysis, we can conclude that propaganda is one of the most powerful factors of de-Christianization in the world through the psychological modifications that it effects, through the ideological morass with which it has flooded the consciousness of the masses, through the reduction of Christianity to the level of an ideology, through the never-ending temptation held out to the church. All this is the creation of a mental universe foreign to Christianity. And this de-Christianization through the effects of one instrument, propaganda, is much greater than through all the anti-Christian doctrines. Propaganda is worse for Christianity than all the anti-Christian doctrines that Smokey complains about. But his viewers are never going to learn that because they're retarded. Yeah, Smokey, I believe you. You say the things that I think, and I like it. You express what I feel, and I'm too cowardly to express myself. Thank God. God bless you, Smokey. Propaganda and democracy. Democracy's need of propaganda. On one fact, there can be no debate: the need of democracy in its present situation to make propaganda. A big footnote. Preceptive authors agree that without propaganda, a democratic state is disarmed at home and abroad, the latter as a result of the famous challenge that sets the democracies and the totalitarian states against each other. But one must not overlook the many setbacks that democracy has suffered for lack of propaganda. Maurice Maigret shows in L'Action psychologique, whatever. Fuck the French words. Maurice shows that the crisis in which the French army found itself from 1950 on was in large part caused by an absence of psychological action on the part of the government, and he demonstrates that the famous plan was less than a great success for the same reasons. Finally, we must remember that if the democratic state is denied the right to make propaganda, such propaganda appears in the form of public relations at the expense of the state, and is all the more dangerous because it's camouflaged. We must understand, besides, that private propaganda, even more than governmental propaganda, is importantly linked to democracy. Historically, from the moment a democratic regime establishes itself, propaganda establishes itself alongside it under various forms. This is inevitable, as democracy depends on public opinion and competition between political parties. In order to come to power, parties make propaganda to gain voters. Let us remember that the advent of the masses through the development of the democracies has provoked the use of propaganda, and that this is precisely one of the arguments of defense of the democratic state. That it appeals to the people, who are mobilized by propaganda, that it defends itself against private interests or anti-democratic parties. It is a remarkable fact worthy of attention that modern propaganda should have begun in the democratic states. During World War I, we saw the combined use of the mass media for the first time. The application of publicity and advertising methods to political affairs, to search for the most effective psychological methods. But in those days, German propaganda was mediocre. The French, English, and American democracies launched big propaganda. Similarly, the Leninist movement, undeniably democratic at the start, developed and perfected all propaganda methods. Contrary to some belief, the authoritarian regimes were not the first to resort to this type of action, although they eventually employed it beyond all limits. This statement should make us think about the relationship between democracy and propaganda. For it is evident that a conflict exists between the principles of democracy, particularly its concept of the individual, and the process of propaganda. The notion of rational man, capable of thinking and living according to reason, of controlling his passions and living according to scientific patterns, of choosing freely between good and evil, all this seems opposed to the secret influences, the mobilizations of myths, the swift appeals to the irrational, so characteristic of propaganda. But this development within the democratic framework can be understood clearly if we look at it not from the level of principles, but from that of actual situations. If, so far, we have concluded that inside a democracy, propaganda is normal and indispensable, even intrinsic to the regime, that there are one or more propagandas at work, nothing seems to make propaganda obligatory in external relations. There, the situation is entirely different. There, the democratic state will want to present itself as the carrier of its entire public opinion, and the democratic nation will want to present itself as a coherent whole. But that creates some difficulty, because such desire does not correspond to a true and exact picture of democracy. Moreover, this implies an endemic, permanent state of war. But, whereas it is easy to show that permanent wars establish themselves at the same time as democratic regimes, it is even easier to demonstrate that these regimes express a strong desire for peace and do not systematically prepare for war. By this, I mean that the economic and sociological conditions of the democracies possibly provoke general conflicts, but that the regime, such as it is not organically tied to war. It is led there, and it adjusts poorly to the situation of the Cold War, which is essentially psychological. Another circumstance imprisons democracy in the ways of propaganda, the persistence of some traits of the democratic ideology. The conviction of the invisible force of truth is tied to the notion of progress and is part of this ideology. Democracies have been fed on the notion that truth may be hidden for a while but will triumph in the end, that truth in itself carries an explosive force, a power of fermentation that will necessarily lead to the end of lies and the shining apparition of the true. This truth was the implicit core of the democratic doctrine. One must stress, furthermore, that this was in itself a truth of an ideological kind that ended by making history because it imposed itself on history. This attitude contained the seeds of, but was at the same time and still is, the exact opposite of the current Marxist attitude that history is truth. Proof through history is nowadays regarded as the proof. He in whose favor history decides was right. But what is to be right when one speaks of history? It is to win, to survive, to be the strongest. This would mean that the strongest and most efficient nowadays is the possessor of the truth. Truth thus has no content of its own, but exists only as history produces it. Truth receives reality through history. One can easily see the relationship between the two attitudes and how one can pass easily from one to the other. For if truth possesses an invincible power that makes it triumph through itself alone, it becomes logical by a simple but dangerous step. That triumph is truth. But, and this is frightening, The consequences of the two attitudes are radically different. To think that democracy must triumph because it is the truth, leads man to be democratic, and to believe that when the democratic regime is opposed to the regimes of oppression, its superiority will be clear at first sight to the infallible judgment of man and history. The choice is thus certain. What amazement is displayed again and again by Democrats, particularly Anglo-Saxon Democrats, when they see that a man selects something else, and that history is indecisive. In such cases, they decide to use information. Because democratic reality was not known, people have made a bad choice, they say. Even there we find the same conviction of the power of truth. But it is not borne out by facts. We will not establish a general law here, to be sure, but we will say that it is not a general law that the truth triumphs automatically, though it may in certain periods of history or with respect to certain varieties. We cannot generalize here at all. History shows that plain truth can be so thoroughly snuffed out that it disappears, and that in certain periods the lie is all-powerful. Even when truth triumphs, does it triumph through itself because it is truth? After all, the eternal varieties defended by Antigone would have, in the eyes of history, have yielded to Creon even if Sophocles had not exited. What the hell is he talking about there? But in our time, the conviction of democracy and its claim to inform people collide with the fact that propaganda follows an entirely different mechanism, performs a function entirely different from that of information, and that nowadays facts do not assume reality in the people's eyes unless they are established by propaganda. Propaganda, in fact, creates truth in the sense that it creates in men subject to propaganda all the signs and indications of true believers. Hey, propaganda creates the truth. You want the truth, you can't handle the truth. You're goddamn right, I ordered the code red. And I do it again, it's Save America. For modern man, propaganda is really creating truth. This means that truth is powerless without propaganda. And in view of the challenge the democracies face, it is of supreme importance that they abandon their confidence in truth as such and assimilate themselves to the methods of propaganda. Unless they do so, considering the present tendencies of civilization, the democratic nations will lose the war conducted in this area. Dude, this blows my mind. Because I believed this shit, dude. I believed that truth would win in the end. I believed people would be able to recognize truth and they would want truth. They all say they want the truth, but apparently it's a lie. I believed this shit. Wow. This guy's like reading my mind. I thought I should follow, if I was a truther and I committed to the truth, I was passionate about the truth, believed in it, did it, that people would see the truth in me and then like be attracted to it. But it's the exact fucking opposite. They hate me. So this idea that truth must triumph is bullshit, clearly. And I was clearly indoctrinated to think this shit. I wonder how many other garbage beliefs I have that I don't even fucking know about. Because it's fucking programmed. We have so many things programmed into us that we don't critically analyze. From Satan. It comes from Satan. Democratic propaganda. Convinced of the necessity for using the means of propaganda, students of that question have found themselves facing the following problem. Totalitarian states have used propaganda to the limit, domestically in order to create conformity, manipulate public opinion, and adjust it to the decisions of the government. Externally, to conduct the Cold War, undermine the public opinion of nations considered enemies, and turn them into willing victims. But if these instruments were used principally by authoritarian states, and if democracies, whose structure seemed made for their use, did not use them, can they now be used by democracies? By that, I mean that the propaganda of the authoritarian state has certain special traits which seem inseparable from that state. Must democratic propaganda have other traits? Is it possible to make democratic propaganda? Let us quickly dismiss the idea that a simple difference of content would mean a difference in character. From the moment that propaganda is used to promulgate democratic ideas, it is good. If it is bad, it is only because of its authoritarian content. Such a position is terribly idealistic and neglects the principal condition of the modern world, the primacy of means over ends. But one may say, and this is a matter worthy of reflection, that democracy itself is not a good propaganda object. Practically all propaganda efforts to promulgate democracy have failed. In fact, one would have to modify the entire concept of democracy considerably to make it a good propaganda object, which at present it is not. Although also in passing, I will mention the following thought. From the moment that democracy uses this instrument, propaganda, propaganda becomes democratic. This thought is not often expressed quite so simply and aggressively, but it is an implicit notion found in most American writers. Nothing can touch democracy, on the contrary. It impresses its character on everything it touches. This prejudice is important for understanding the American democratic mythology and the tentative adoption of this principle by other popular democracies. Such positions are so superficial and so remote from the actual situation that they do not need to be discussed. Besides, they usually come from journalists or commentators, and not from men who have seriously studied the problem of propaganda and its effects. Even the majority of the latter, however, retain the conviction that one can set up a propaganda system that expresses the democratic character and does not alter the working of democracy. This is the double demand that one must make of propaganda in a democratic regime. It is argued that the first condition would be met by the absence of a monopoly in a democracy of the means of propaganda and by the free interplay of various propagandas. True, compared with the state monopoly and the unity of propaganda in totalitarian states, one finds a great diversity of press and radio in democratic countries. But this fact must not be stressed too much. Although there is no state or legal monopoly, there is, nevertheless, indeed a private monopoly. Even where there are many newspapers, publishers, concentration as a result of the newspaper chains is well established, and the monopolization of news agencies, of distribution and so on is well known. In the field of radio or of motion pictures, the same situation prevails. Obviously, not everybody can own propaganda media. In the United States, most radio and motion picture corporations are very large. The others are secondary and unable to compete, and centralization still goes on. The trend everywhere is in the direction of a very few, very powerful companies controlling all the propaganda media. Are they still private? In any event, as we have already seen, the state must make its propaganda, if only under the aspect of disseminating news. Assuming that information is an indispensable element of a democracy, it is necessary that the information promulgated by the state be credible. Without credibility, it will fail. But what happens when a powerful private propaganda organization denies facts and falsifies information? Who can tell where truth lies? On whom can the citizen rely to judge the debate? It is on this level that the dialogue really takes place. The problem, then, is whether the state will support a private competitor who controls media equal or superior to its own, but makes different propaganda. It may even be entirely legitimate for the state to suppress or annex such a competitor. Some will say, freedom of expression is democracy. To prevent propaganda is to violate democracy. Certainly, but it must be remembered that the freedom of expression of one or two powerful companies that do not express the thoughts of the individual or small groups, but of capitalist interests or an entire public, does not exactly correspond to what was called freedom of expression a century ago. One must remember, further, that the freedom of expression of one who makes a speech to a limited audience is not the same as that of the speaker who has all the radio sets in the country at his disposal. All the more as the science of propaganda gives to these instruments a shock effect that the non-initiated cannot equal. I refer in this connection to the excellent study by Rivero, who demonstrates the immense difference between the 19th and 20th centuries in this respect. In the 19th century, the problem of opinion formation through the expression of thought was essentially a problem of contacts between the state and the individual, and a problem of acquisition of a freedom. But today, thanks to the mass media, the individual finds himself outside the battle. The debate is between the state and powerful groups. Freedom to express ideas is no longer at stake in this debate. What we have is mastery and domination by the state or by some powerful groups over the whole of the technical media of opinion formation. The individual has no access to them. He is no longer a participant in this battle for free expression of ideas. He is the stake. What matters for him is which voice he will be permitted to hear and which words will have the power to obsess him. It is in the light of this perfect analysis that one must ask oneself what freedom of expression still means in a democracy. But even if the state held all the instruments of propaganda, and this becomes increasingly probable for political, economic, and financial reasons, particularly so far as TV is concerned. But even if the state held all the instruments of propaganda, what characterizes democracy is that it permits the expression of different propagandas. This is true. But it is impossible to permit the expression of all opinion. Immoral and aberrant opinions are justifiably subject to censorship. Purely personal opinions and even more certain political tendencies are necessarily excluded. No freedom for the enemies of freedom is the watchword then. Well, that's like when Smokey says he doesn't tolerate enemies of God, right? No freedom for the enemies of freedom. No freedom for the enemies of Jesus. Same shit, right? Thus, the democracies create for themselves a problem of limitation and degree. Who then will exclude certain propaganda instruments? For the fascists, the communists are the enemies of truth. For the communists, the enemies of freedom are the bourgeoisie, the fascists, the cosmopolitans. And for the democracy, obviously all enemies of democracy. Matters are even more serious. In time of war, everybody agrees that news must be limited and controlled, and that all propaganda not in the national interest must be prohibited. From that fact grows a unified propaganda. The problem that now arises is this. We have talked of the Cold War, but it seems that the democracies have not yet learned that the Cold War is no longer an exceptional state, a state analogous to hot war, which is transitory, but is becoming a permanent and endemic state. There are many reasons for that. I will name only one: propaganda itself. Propaganda directed to territories outside one's borders is a weapon of war. This does not depend on the will of those who use it or on a doctrine, but is a result of the medium itself. Propaganda has such an ability to affect psychological transformations and such an impact on the very core of man that it inevitably has military force when used by a government and directed to the outside. There is no simple use of propaganda. A propaganda conflict is hardly less serious than an armed conflict. It is inevitable, therefore, that in Cold War the same attitude exists as in the case of Hot War. One feels the need to unify propaganda. Here, democracies are caught in a vicious circle from which they seem unable to escape. There's a bunch of little niggers outside my window. I can see like 5 little niggers. Am I allowed to show them on cam? Looks just like fucking Africa out there, dude. Okay. The other principal aspect of democratic propaganda is that it is subject to certain values. It is not unfettered, but fettered. It is an instrument not of passion, but of reason. Footnotes. Propaganda as such is limited in the democracies by law, by the separation of powers, and so on. See, for example, Trends in the 20th Century Propaganda by Ernst Kriss and Nathan Lietz, who contrast the appeal to the superego and to the irrational by authoritarian propaganda with democratic propaganda, which is directed at the ego. Right. How should I shut off my AC? The other principal aspect of democratic propaganda is that it is subject to certain values. It is not unfettered, but fettered. It is not an instrument. It is an instrument not of passion, but of reason. Therefore, democratic propaganda must be essentially truthful. I must speak only the truth and base itself only on facts. This can be observed in American propaganda. It is undeniable that American information and propaganda are truthful, but that does not seem to me characteristic of democracy. The formula with which Americans explain their attitude is, the truth pays. That is, propaganda based on truth is more effective than any other. Besides, Hitler's famous statement on the lie is not a typical trait of propaganda. There is an unmistakable evolution here. Lies and falsifications are used less and less. We've already said that. The use of precise facts is becoming increasingly common. Conversely, the use of nuances and certain suppleness reveals an attitude peculiar to democracy. At bottom, there is a certain respect for the human being, unconscious perhaps, and becoming steadily weaker, but nevertheless still there. Even the most Machiavellian of Democrats respects the conscience of his listener and does not treat him with haste or contempt. The tradition of respecting the individual has not yet been eliminated, and this leads to all sorts of consequences. I think it has been now. First, it limits propaganda. The democratic state uses propaganda only if driven by circumstances. for example, traditionally after wars. But whereas private and domestic propaganda is persistent in its effects, governmental and external propaganda evaporate easily. Besides, such propaganda is not total, does not seek to envelop all of human life, to control every form of behavior, to attach itself ultimately to one's person. Let me see. A third trait of democratic propaganda is that it looks at both sides of the coin. The democratic attitude is frequently close to that of a university. There is no absolute truth. Well, universities aren't like this anymore. This is back when universities were about, like, you know, free thinking and all that. It's not like that anymore. Okay. The democratic attitude is frequently close to that of a university. There is no absolute truth, and it is acknowledged that the opponent has some good faith, some justice, some reason on his side. It is a question of nuances. There is no strict rule, except in time of war, about good on one side and bad on the other. Finally, the democratic propagandist or democratic state will often have a bad conscience about using propaganda. The old democratic conscience still gets in the way and burdens him. He has the vague feeling that he is engaged in something illegitimate. Thus, for the propagandist in a democracy to throw himself fully into his task, it is necessary that he believe that he formulate his own convictions when he makes propaganda. Lasswell has named still another difference between democratic and totalitarian propaganda, pertaining to the technique of propaganda itself, and distinguishing between contrasted incitement and positive incitement. The first consists of a stimulus unleashed by the experimenter or the authorities in order to produce in the masses an effect in which those in power do not participate. This, according to Lasswell, is the customary method of despotism. Conversely, the positive incitement, symbolizing the extended brotherly hand, is a stimulus that springs from what the powers that be really feel, in which they want to make the masses participate. It is a communal action. This analysis is roughly accurate. All this represents the situation in which democracies find themselves in the face of propaganda, and indicates the differences between democratic and authoritarian propaganda methods. But I must now render a very serious judgment on such activity, democratic propaganda. All that I have described adds up to ineffectual propaganda, precisely to the extent that the propagandist retains his respect for the individual. He denies himself the very penetration that is the ultimate aim of all propaganda, that of provoking action without prior thought. By respecting nuances, he neglects the major law of propaganda. Every assertion must be a trenchant and total. To the extent that he remains partial, he fails to use the mystique. But that mystique is indispensable for well-made propaganda. To the extent that a democratic propagandist has a bad conscience, he cannot do good work, nor can he when he believes in his own propaganda. As concerns Lasswell's distinction, the technique of propaganda demands one form or the other, depending on circumstances. In any event, propaganda always creates a schism between the government and the mass, the same schism I have described in the book The Technological Society, which we're going to read next. Probably should have read that first. And that is provoked by all the techniques, whose practitioners constitute a sort of aristocracy of technicians and who modify the structures of the state. The aristocracy of technicians, is that like Jack Dorsey and fucking Zuckerberg, fucking Elon Musk, all those cocksuckers, and fucking Jeff Bezos? Eat a dick, bag of fucking dicks. According to Lasswell's analysis, propaganda based on contrasted Propaganda based on contrasted incitation expresses a despotism. I would rather say that it expresses an aristocracy, but the famous massive democracy corresponds to that, is that. Ultimately, even if one tries to maintain confidence and communion between the government and the governed, all propaganda ends up as a means by which the prevailing powers manipulate the masses. The true propagandist must be as cold, lucid, and rigorous as a surgeon. There are subjects and objects. A propagandist who believes in what he says and lets himself become a victim of his own game will have the same weaknesses as a surgeon who operates on a loved one or a judge who presides at a trial of a member of his own family. To use the instrument of propaganda nowadays, one must have a scientific approach, the lack of which was the weakness that became apparent in Nazi propaganda in its last few years. Clearly, after 1943, one could see from its content that Goebbels had begun to believe it himself. Thus, some of democracy's fundamental aspects paralyze the conduct of propaganda. There is, therefore, no democratic propaganda. Propaganda made by the democracies is ineffective, paralyzed, mediocre. We can say the same when there is a diversity of propagandas. When various propagandas are permitted to express themselves, they become ineffective with respect to their immediate objective. This ineffectiveness with regard to the citizens of a democracy needs more analysis. Let us merely emphasize here that our propaganda is outclassed by that of totalitarian states. This means that ours does not do its job. But in view of the challenge we face, it is imperative that ours be effective. One must therefore abandon the traits that are characteristic of democracy, but paralyzing for propaganda. The combination of effective propaganda and respect for the individual seems impossible. There is a last element which I shall mention briefly. Jacques Drencourt has demonstrated that propaganda is totalitarian in its essence, not because it is the handmaiden of the totalitarian state, but because it has a tendency to absorb everything. This finding is the best part of his work. It means that when one takes that route, one cannot stop halfway. One must use all instruments and all methods that make propaganda effective. One must expect, and developments over the past dozen years show it, that the democracies will abandon their precautions and their nuances and throw themselves wholeheartedly into effective propaganda action. Black Lives Matter. But such action will no longer have a special democratic character. We must now examine the effects that the making of propaganda has on democracy. To measure that, we must distinguish between external and domestic propaganda. We must not retain the illusion that propaganda is merely a neutral instrument that one can use without being affected. It is comparable to radium, and what happens to the radiologist is well known. Shit. Okay, that was like reading for an hour, and I'm like 15 pages from the appendix. And then the appendix is like 50 pages. Son of a bitch. And then we're going to read the Technological Society. And I'm a chronic masturbator. But it's not my fault. I'm a victim of propaganda.